Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining today. My name is Lucía Alcalde. First of all, I would like to thank the Bibliophile Society of Antwerp for inviting me to present my research during this last year in today's webinar. And I would also like to thank my Steven Van Impe, my mentor during my internship in the Hendrik Conscience Library, for introducing me to the society and letting them know about my research. I'm a master research student of Renaissance Studies in Utrecht University. I'm just finishing my thesis, which is part of the presentation that I'm going to present today. And in the past, I completed a bachelor's degree in comparative literature in La Universidad Complutense de Madrid. But without further delay, let's delve into the presentation. When we think about political power in Renaissance Europe, we often imagine um, diplomatic negotiations, marriages, magnificent courts. And whilst all of these were essential in the daily life of early modern individuals, yet one of the most revealing expressions of power and identity happens to be found in a much wider space, which is the library. Today, I would like to introduce you to the library of Margaret of Austria, who was regent and governess of the Low Countries from 1507 till 1530, and who was one of the most influential female figures in early 16th century Europe. Through the reconstruction of her library of nearly 400 volumes, it becomes possible not only to examine some splendid volumes that we will see and that she owned, but also to examine broader questions regarding female reading practices, dynastic representation, and humanist culture in the 16th century. The meaning of the library has always been in constant flux. It's nothing static. In 1547, it was defined by Lipsius as a place in which books are kept, a bookcase, or books themselves. And later on, this was more developed by scholars like Furetière, which engaged with the concept of the library more from the point of view of the collection and the internal logic of the collection, which includes a fashion that varies over time for a variety of practical, economical, and cultural reasons that probably all of you as collectors know about. But what becomes inherently conveyed by the very logic of collecting at this point is that there must be a consistency that runs through all the different volumes gathered in this particular space of the library. It is also established, therefore, that the library is not barely a private space created by an individual taste, but rather that it exists in harmony with other trends at the time it emerges. In this analysis, of course, I regard Margaret's library as a social space rather than an isolated one. And for that reason, I would like to give you a very brief overview of the general ideas surrounding the existence of literacy, books, and literature in the 16th century. At this time, the library represented many things. However, it was not a space that encompassed the world's universal knowledge. However, what is indeed true is that it may aspire to fulfill that purpose, and that is precisely the compelling part. With the development of early culture, literacy and books became to be associated with ideals of prestige and moral refinement that characterize European dynasties and aristocracy and noble families. It was from around 1100 onwards that a distinctive cultural tradition began to take shape, accompanied by the growing use of the vernacular as the language of culture in which the cultural foundations of Europe were being revealed after the long Middle Ages. This was further accompanied by the decline of the monastery's hegemony, which for centuries had dominated the production, circulation, and also collection of books. This then was reinforced by the rediscovery of Greek and Latin authors and its translation as well to a vernacular, and whose works became an essential body of literature for, let's say, the consolidation of what intellectualism meant in the 16th century. A desire emerged to gather and encompass this knowledge in a single space, That's why we have an emergence of major libraries within European royal and noble families, from more medieval examples such as the Studiolo by the Duke of Urbino to more prototypical early modern libraries like La Biblioteca del Escorial. In these spaces, the courts found a way to reflect their elevated status as, I like to say, the libraries were stages where they could perform their authority. This is very famously exemplified by Sebastian Brandt, who was the Chancellor of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, who happens to be the father of Margaret of Austria, as it is stated in the first pages of the Ship of Fools. He says, "For this is my mind, this one pleasure I have, of books to have plenty, and apparently I take no wisdom of them." And later on, "The cause is plain and easy to discern, still I am the best at books assembling. For to have plenty, it is a pleasant thing, in my opinion, and to have them always in hand. But what they mean, I do not understand." These verses capture a profound truth of the late 15th century, and it's how books were collected not only because of their intellectual value, but also because they became objects of aesthetic values and symbols of prestige for the elite. That is why Margaret of Austria library, compared to one of her predecessor, Margaret of York, who only owned around 30 manuscripts, more or less, is a very extensive one, as I just said, of almost 400 volumes. This places Margaret of Austria's library in line with other European ones that were being built at the same time. This also means that Margaret's library played a very specific role within the Habsburg dynasty. However, it was a collection curated to a certain extent by Margaret herself and shaped by the course of her own life. The court that Margaret created in Mechelen was recognized by contemporaries to herself as her own court, her own space, and her own library. This is recorded, for example, by the painter Dürer in his diary, where he basically recounts how he went to visit Dame Margaret and how she showed him all her beautiful things. And at the end, he says, "And I saw many other splendid things and a splendid library." All these things that Dürer is referring to are the property of Madame. Therefore, these kind of evidences let us wonder and ask the question, to what extent was Margaret involved in the construction or acquisition of certain volumes of her library? How can we view her library not merely as a royal library, as a library of the Habsburg dynasty, which of course it was, but also as a library of a governess? To do this and to be able to analyze its contents, I must give a brief overview of her life because it was her own life course that shaped her collection, as you will see. Daughter of Maximilian I and Mary of Burgundy, Margaret found herself from a very young age completely embedded in the complex network of marital alliances that characterized late 15th century Europe. When she was only 3 years old, Margaret was betrothed to the Dauphin Charles, the future Charles VIII, and was sent to France to be raised under the guidance of Anne de France, the future writer of Les Enseignements. Margaret's education, we could say, was in feminine from the beginning, as were her first encounters with literature, because we know that when she was in France, she was able to work with the volumes that were read the volumes that were part of the Library of Charlotte of Savoy. We know this because, and I find this example very sweet, in one of the volumes, she wrote a short list of her court ladies. Owing to different reasons, this marriage never took place, and Margaret left France in 1491 to return to the Low Countries under the wing of her godmother, Margaret of York. 6 years later, Maximilian I and the Spanish Catholic kings arranged the famous double nuptials between Philip the Handsome and Juana I of Castile and Prince Juan of Asturias and Girona with Margaret of Austria. The marital dowry given to Margaret by the Catholic kings included several books. Some of them, we could say, they were properly feminine, like two Book of Hours or the the scriptures written in Romance, in this case in Castilian. But they also included a Romance, also written in Castilian, as well as 3 books written in French, one of them called The Mirror of the City of Ladies, so Christine de Pizan. The marriage ended quite tragically because Juan died only 6 months after the wedding, which left Margaret widowed and pregnant at the time, even though she suffered a miscarriage very soon after. 2 years after his death, she returned to the Low Countries, being able to bring back the volumes, including the diary that I presented. And moreover, during the 2 years she remained in the Iberian Peninsula, she acquired other volumes, such as Repetición de Amores y Arte Ajedrez, as well as a translation to Castilian of Melusine by Jean Darras. These are wonderfully rich volumes. Both of them are incunabula and are nowadays held in the KBR, and they reveal a great deal about Margaret's literary taste and aesthetic ideas because they were acquired by her personally. Later on, she married Philibert II, Duke of Savoy, with whom she shared a very happy, even though very short, marriage because he died in 1504. This succession of personal losses probably is what gave rise to Margaret's personal motto, which is Fortune, Infortune, Fortune. However, from these unions, she also acquired several volumes, or rather, she ordered the transportation of several volumes from Savoy to the Low Countries with her. Margaret's time in Savoy was a time of splendor because she was able to start maneuvering the arts of politics and governance, because Philibert II wasn't especially interested in these affairs. It was perhaps this autonomy and sovereignty over the territory which encouraged her to take several of these volumes back with her to the Low Countries. Among them are very famous examples, like, for example, the very rich hours of the Duke of Berry, which probably you're all well acquainted with, alongside historical volumes like these ones held in the KBR, or also romances like Merlin or the history of the Saint Graal. Later on, she settled in the Low Countries in Mechelen. She refused to get married again, and even though in the beginning she acted as a regent and sought for her father's consent advice, and we know this because they share a very extensive correspondence, once he died, her nephew and at the time Emperor Charles V granted her the governorship of the Low Countries to a great degree of autonomy, authority. This position required her to navigate both the expectations placed upon her as a member of a ruling, very powerful dynasty and the particular challenges associated with exercising female authority in the early 16th century. It was her settlement in Mechelen that led to the creation of her library because she did not have an itinerant court. In this space, she was able to gather all the volumes that she had been acquiring through the course of her life due to different reasons. And it was also from there that she continued to commission some works, resulting in her very vast library of 400 volumes. She also inherited many volumes from different family members, such as, for example, Charles de Croix, the Duke of Chimay, or Philip the Bold, Margaret of Flanders, her own mother, Mary of Burgundy, and Margaret of York, her godmother. Each of these figures contributed not only to the collection itself, but also to Margaret of Austria's relationship with reading. However, I think that after having briefly outlined her life story, we can conclude that many of the volumes were also purchased by Margaret, and as such, we can glean from these particular volumes a sense of her literary taste. However, before presenting her library, and so that you can admire and appreciate how rich it is, I have to outline the prevailing views regarding women reading habits and what books they were expected to be reading. To do this, I would talk about many treatises on the subject. However, the main treatise that devotes an entire chapter to the topic and as far as I'm aware of, is Juan Luis Vives' The Education of the Christian Woman. This work was written for the education of Mary I of England and dedicated to Catherine of Aragon. And it was very popular during the following centuries. We know this because it was translated to different vernacular languages. It is divided into 3 books, and it follows the life cycle of women as daughters, wives, and widows. In book 1, chapter 5, titled What Books to Be Read and What Not, Vives reflects on the contents that should be consumed by the good Christian woman. Interestingly, Vives, in general terms, has been considered a proto-feminist author who acknowledged the necessity of education for princesses and female members of royalty and nobility. However, this education had always to be supervised by a male figure, either father, husband, or in the case of Margaret, nephew. And if a woman began to read books that would damage her virtue, her father and friends should provide that she may be kept from all reading, and so by this use forget learning. On the subject of literature, Gibbs states that the study that literature good literature, what he considers good literature. It's good because it leaves the mind to the contemplation of beautiful things, and it also helps to kind of fortify the mind with good precepts and counsels of good living. But of course, he's always considering one type of literature. He also states that if women were reading the wrong books, it were better for them not only to have no learning at all, but also to lose their eyes that they should not read and their ears that they should not hear. He mentions this when talking about romances and love poetry, um, what which he describes as poison. Books such as Lancelot, Melusine, Tristan, La Celestina, um, have no other purpose but to corrupt the manners of young folks, just in his words. Also, these books tended to be written in the vernacular, and Vives is a strong defender of Latin as the language of culture and condemns reading and writing in vernacular languages. He also mentions some other authors like Pojus, Aeneas Sylvius, or Boccaccio, whose works were written when they were still in the shadow of learning themselves, so they shouldn't be read because of their immaturity. In matters of poetry, he's going to praise some ancient poets like Callimaco or Sappho, but he's also going to criticize others like Ovid and in particular the Book of Love. He mentions these particular examples of literature condemned that I put here so that readers can be aware that some books are serpents or snakes. In contrast, of course, he's going to recommend the Gospels, the Epistles, the Old Testament, fathers of the church, as wise authors that women should read because they are going to help them to set themselves in a daily Christian quietness, and they are going to help them cultivate their virtues. He also mentions that all the books read by women should be chosen following the advice of learned and sensible men. And in his curriculum for Mary, the First of England, he also praises some contemporary authors like Erasmo or Thomas More, along with some historians, but very briefly and very few. Vives thus emerges as a key figure in my analysis when constructing an accurate index of what women should read and what they should avoid, although opinions may vary because they were certainly more, let's say, progressive humanists, like, for example, Thomas More, because also he had 3 daughters, or Thomas Eliot. Vives' work offers a representative understanding of the moral hierarchies of early modern literary culture. So we know that these ideas circulated among European courts. I mean, this book was dedicated for a princess, meaning that noble women were aware of them. This raises an essential question, which is to what extent did elite women who had the means and authority to build libraries conform to the ideals proposed by male humanist thinkers? It is within this framework that Margaret of Austria and her collection has to be examined because her library offers not only a window into the intellectual and aesthetic values of early 16th century society, but also an opportunity to assess how noble women actually navigated this very complicated world full of humanist norms. So now I will focus on what volumes made up her library. This analysis will be conducted through three interrelated dimensions. First of all, I'm going to focus in the literary genre because this is going to help us understand how Margaret of Austria's library didn't followed or not followed Vive's perceptions that I just presented. But then focusing on languages and materiality, we are also going to understand how Margaret Library was also a social space. To reconstruct Margaret's library, very luckily, we have two original inventories, one from 1516 and another one from 1523. This is something that didn't happen before the 16th century so much, especially among women's libraries. Also because normally they were just merged into male libraries. And these inventories were compiled and reprinted in the 19th century. And it is on these two inventories that an essential work by the scholar Marguerite Deva emerges. In this volume, that book that you can see here, she includes the volumes that appear in both inventories and also she traces where they currently are. This is a very difficult task because the original inventories do not necessarily or consistently record the title of the book nor the author. Rather, they consist on a physical description of what the item looked like. Like, for example, here it says that it's written in Latin and that the covers are made out of green velvet from Bruges, but it doesn't say anything about the book itself. Regarding the total number of volumes, I have identified 383, and almost half of them are lost. Of course, not all volumes can be included in my analysis because it wouldn't be accurate enough. Therefore, lost volumes and those whose genre cannot be identified because very vague inventory descriptions have been excluded. However, identifiable lost ones are part of the analysis because if we exclude all of them, it means we lose half of Margaret's library. These identifiable ones are duplicate copies, widely circulated texts like the Consolation of Philosophy, volumes whose genre is explicitly indicated in the inventories. These only happen very often with Chronicles and Book of Hours. For the analysis of literary genres, I have adopted a twofold classification system. First, distinguishing between sacred and profane or secular literature, and then dividing these categories into more subgroups. Well, of course, the boundaries between the sacred and the profane were very fluid in late medieval and early modern periods. This division provides a very useful framework for understanding the relevance of Margaret's library because the reality of her library challenges all the statements presented by Vives, who said that women's reading habits should mainly consist on sacred and devotional literature. The reality of Margaret's library tells a very different story, as this graph shows. Sacred literature constitutes only 24% of her collection, and within this group, I distinguish four subgroups. First, there are scriptural texts like Bible, Gospel, Psalters, or Apocalypses, which constitute the foundation of Christian reading culture. Mm. Closely related to these ones are liturgical books like Missals or Book of Hours, which structure at the point both public and private devotion, and which were central in daily religious practices of every individual. Book of Hours were particularly associated with lay devotional reading and especially with female literacy and practices of piety. Then I also distinguish devotional, mystical literature, and hagiographies, which reflect maybe not a more, but more an effective mode of piety that gained increasing prominence during the late Middle Ages onwards, with movements, very famous ones, such as the Devote Moderna in the Low Countries. Doctrinal works, including theological and scholastic writings by the fathers or the church, are also included within this category because they engage directly with the interpretation and codification of Christian culture and doctrine, as well as with the spread of it, of course. And if you have some very beautiful examples, this is the Bible Moralice and is in the KBR. The category of profane and secular literature is much more complicated. It constitutes 71% of the collection, and I have identified many literary genres. Within this category, historical writings constitute the most substantial part of the collection. I have divided history and chronics, but they are together. Chronicles represent more structured narratives, maybe more medieval ones, whilst in history, I have included volumes that deal with historical subject, but they adopt different literary forms associated maybe with other genres, like, for example, epic poetry or romances or songs. But such hybridity is actually um, a reflection of the transitional nature of historiographical writing during the late Middle Ages and the early modern period. And this is the manuscript that tells the story about the order of the Toussaint d'Or of the Habsburg dynasty. I have also identified a substantial body of educational and moral literature. These texts include both didactic treatises, Mirror for Princes, but also texts situated maybe in broader moral and educational debates of the time, like, for example, the Querelle des Femmes. Examples include volumes such as the Lost One, Le Roman de la Rose by Jean Molinet, or the City of Ladies by Christine Pizan, which engage with broader questions of virtue, gender, and currently values. But at the end, they are concerned with the education of the aristocracy and the nobility, both male and female, as it can be observed during as it can be observed through these volumes, we can see that Margaret was especially interested in female education because she possessed a book of Les Champions des Dames by Martin Lefranc and also many volumes of Christine de Pizan, like this one, that in this case is the City of Ladies. Philosophical works include the revival of classical authors, which was characteristic of humanism, like, for example, Cicero de Officiis, but also more medieval works, very popular at the time, like the Consolation of Philosophy that I already mentioned by Boethius. Then see on a few scientific works, encyclopedic work, other volumes related to astronomy, geography, and the natural world in general, which represent forms of knowledge that were increasingly being conceptualized as distinct domains of inquiry during the late Middle Ages and the early modern period. And this development of different kinds of of disciplines is very closely connected to the widespread use of the educational structures based in the trivium and the quadrivium, because it organized learning into distinct disciplines. And in relation to more purely fictional genres, I have identified romances, novella, poetry, theater. And within this group, as you can see, Romance literature occupies a particular complex position because he owned 44 volumes, but they were all from different geographical areas in different languages with formal variations because, of course, romances are not consistent. They vary over different territories. Um, it's not only impressive that she possessed 44 romances, but even more significantly, she owned several of the works that Vives explicitly condemned. Um, she owned one copy of Tristan, two copies of Lancelot du Lac, one copy of Paris and Vienna, one copy of the Cameron, and two copies of Melusine. The irony is particularly striking in the case of Melusine because this is a romance that B.S. dismisses as the one of the heartless mistress. And as I presented before with the course of her life, this is one of the romances that Margaret acquired herself in the Iberian Peninsula. These romances, of course, are not chosen arbitrarily by Vives because Tristan or Lancelot du Lac focuses on adultery. Paris and Vienna if, explored kind of romantic fidelity across very difficult social and political obstacles. The Cameron was worldly famous even at the time for its tales of wit, desire, deception. And Melusine, it's a very interesting romance that combines the representation of dynastic origins with the figure of Melusine, who is a woman with female evil supernatural mysteries. Um, and this is a comparison of the incunabula that she acquired in Spain, a few illustrations. And this is another one that was also part of her library, but this is a manuscript and it's in French. Moreover, going back, moreover, all these romances place emotion at the center of the narrative, as well as individuals' experience, inviting the reader to identify themselves. From the 44 romances, we can, of course, conclude that there is a clear inclination towards this genre. Not only because of the 44 volumes, but because, as I said, they come from different contexts that Margaret was involved herself. Together with Romance literature, I have identified these smaller groups of novella, theater, poetry. For example, theater is only one. Um, and although I know that they are way less, I think they are important because they demonstrate the circulation of certain literary traditions in curly environments. Like, for example, the novellas that she had, like Les Nouvelles Nouvelles or the Cameron, were bestsellers at the time. So it's not unusual that she owned it, especially Les Nouvelles Nouvelles. Um, in regards to rhetorics, law, military arts, it's true that Vives does not devote a specific section to these disciplines. However, he does state that he is not at all concerned with eloquence because a woman has no need of that, as well as stating that it is better for a woman to stay at home and be unknown to others. In company, it is befitting that she be retiring and silent, with her eyes cast down, so that some perhaps may see her, but none will hear her. So I wonder, and I guess maybe you're wondering as well, how can this be applied to a woman like Margaret of Austria, who held a very active political office in the Habsburg dynasty? It doesn't make any sense. Not only did she have to forge active diplomatic relations, but she also had to cultivate her own intellect in order to be a befitting representative for the dynasty. Thus, as the literary analysis of her library reveals, 55% of her collection was dedicated to very different disciplines like history, geography, law, and military arts, the already presented ones, which reflects also the governess' wisdom as a widely respected political figure in the 16th century. Also, they reflect Margaret's interest in turning her court in Mechelen into an educational center for the young princes and princesses of Europe, just as had been the case with Charles V, who is this little boy in the middle of the triptych, as well as his sisters like Eleanor of Austria, Isabella of Austria, or Mary of Hungary, whose education was equally supervised by Margaret. This tension between Vives' prescriptions and Margaret of Austria, sorry, reading habits becomes even more evident if it is extended to music. Vives does not state anything particular about music, that is true, but he says that it is only admissible if it helps elevating the soul towards God. Music, like literature, must be regulated in order to prevent the imagination from wandering around. Mechelen's court, the Burgundian court, however, was renowned for its ceremonial soundscape, in which music was not only a tool for devotional practice, which of course it was, but also as a key instrument of representation and celebration, Burgundian identity. I have identified 10 volumes as part of the musical genre. 5 of these volumes are lost, but a great deal can be said about the remaining 5, because even though she did not tend to mark the volumes in her collection, neither with her ex libris or signatures or ownership marks inside her books, which is something bizarre because Margaret of York before her see Mark his books, and Mary of Hungary, who is going to follow Margaret of Austria's position, also mark her volumes, but Margaret of Austria didn't do it. But her music volumes are a notable exception. The appearance of her coat of arms here may reflect, of course, a personal interest with this discipline. Also, we know that she commissioned some of these works, like, for example, the Chansonnière or the Album Poétique. And also in the original inventories, these volumes in particular are accompanied by the Marguerite, which reinforces this ownership. That is why Margaret of Austria's relationship with music is still one of the main areas of study when researching the figure of the governess, of course. Also, in the volume of the Recueil de Basse Danse, the provenance of which remains very uncertain and has been the subject of numerous studies, there is an even stronger mark of personal ownership, as evidenced by what is believed to be a handwritten note by Margaret of Austria, in which she presents as the Princess of Spain. A particular representation also in these volumes that deserves to be mentioned is in the Chansonnière. The governess appears depicted before a lectern. This miniature helps to construct an image of Margaret that intertwines many things, like devotion and literacy, as well as music. And it's quite funny because it situates her within the boundaries of what was expected of her as a royal woman, no? Because she's praying, she's being virtuous, but at the same time, by deciding to be depicted in this volume, she is emphasizing her personal involvement with the manuscript. As Driver has argued in relation to women's identity through the medieval period and the early modern period, these kind of images in manuscripts should not be understood as transparent reflections of reality, but rather as something that refracts reality, becoming a mirror, whether a funhouse distortion or a real seeming reflection of the culture producing it. Therefore, this miniature of Margaret does not only function as a paratext, but also as a very meticulous visual articulation of her own identity. Clearly, the musical genre played a particular role in Margaret's library and in Margaret's life because of these marks and this patronage of musical manuscripts, which in my research and in this presentation are understood as evidence of a personal taste and a personal involvement with her collection. Moving on to the language analysis, the vast majority of the books are written or are translated into French, which is hardly surprising because French was the principal language of administration, as well as devotional writing and literary culture in the Burgundian-Habsburg sphere. And this use of the vernacular as it was introduced is something that Vives particularly condemned, but it's something he couldn't control because it was taking place. The vernacular tradition had already begun to take root with Margaret of Flanders and Margaret of York, but it really reached its peak with Margaret of Austria because 71% of her collection are written in these languages. However, the interesting part in Margaret's library is that she also owned books written not only in French, but in Castilian, in Italian, and a few in Catalan and Provençal. In Castilian, she owned a few romances, such as the one mentioned Melusina. In Italian, she owned a few gospels and a few hagiographies. The Italian influence, of course, it was widespread throughout Europe, but in the case of the Burgundian-Habsburg court, is particularly relevant because it happened after the marriage of Maximilian I with Bianca Maria Sforza. The isolated examples of Hebrew and Greek may reflect an interest and an awareness of Margaret with humanism and the popularity that philological studies had in the 16th century. Even though it's a very short percentage, the 6% of books in Latin still show how this language was used in sacred literature as well as in scientific and legal texts. Latin was, of course, still considered a language of authority, but vernacular languages, and in particular within women reading habits, just kept growing. The linguistic diversity of her collection reflects her presented life course as well as her dynastic and political network. Life course because there was no way or very difficult Margaret would have possessed around 15 volumes in Castilian if she wouldn't have traveled to the Iberian Peninsula. I think this brings the presentation to a perfect roundup with the material perspective, um, because although the literary analysis has enabled us to gain, I think, a greater insight into Margaret's literary taste, the material analysis positions her library as a social space where the fashion of the moment is reflected. Her library emerges within two main modes of book production, which are the manuscript culture and the increase in circulation of printed books. Added to this is the oldest form of printed, which is incunabula, which remains highly popular and valued to her day. At this point, however, manuscripts retain a very strong aesthetic value within the aristocracy, and in particularly within the Burgundian court and the Habsburg dynasty. That is why the vast majority of her volumes are manuscripts. Their presence, as well as Margaret's commission of some of them, demonstrate that manuscript culture had by no means disappeared in the beginning of the 16th century after the arrival of print. Rather, both forms coexisted during the 16th century onwards and fulfilled very different cultural functions. However, I think that at the same time, the presence of printed books in her library, even though it's very minimal, it's only 4%, I think it reflects an interest in new forms of written production on the part of this very active humanist who was seeking to create a court of learning that was active and very much in touch with the reality around her. The incunabula occupy an intermediate position between the manuscript and the printed books because even though they are mechanically reproduced, they imitate the aesthetic conventions of manuscripts because of rubrication, illumination, decorating initials. But to sum up, the material diversity of her collection reveals differences in use and function of volumes. Uh, but at the end, manuscript still held a very dominant position as a source not only of aesthetic value, but as a practical object, rather than the printed books amongst the elite circle. I think that after this three-dimensional analysis, we can conclude that Margaret's library offers more than a far inventory of books, as any good collection does. It provides a unique lens through which we can understand one of the most influential women of early 16th century Europe. Throughout this presentation, I have argued that her collection should not be understood only as a dynastic library inherited from previous generation, which of course to a certain degree it was, but also as a personal library shaped by her experiences, her own networks, and her interests. The books he acquired in France, in Castile, in Savoy, and in the Low Countries reveal a life lived across the major political and cultural centers of Europe at the time, while the diversity of genres, languages, and formats reflects the complexity of the intellectual world in the 16th century. Also, her library challenges contemporary prescription concerning optimal reading habits, while authors like Vives envision this very carefully controlled literary education centered merely on devotional and sacred literature. This was clearly not taking place among elite women. Margaret's collection demonstrates a much broader engagement with history, romances, politics, music, and humanist learning in general. Rather than a passive recipient of cultural ideals, he appears as a very active participant in the construction of knowledge and curly culture in Mechelen. The library therefore allows us to see Margaret not only as a governess of the Habsburg dynasty, but also as a reader, as a patron, as a collector, as a cultural agent, as through her books, we gain access to the ways in which Renaissance women could negotiate power, identity, and learning with a world that just sought to define the limits of female authority. And ultimately, studying Margaret's library reminds us that books are never merely objects. They are traces of lives, ambitions, relationships, and intellectual choices. And in the case of Margaret of Austria, they reveal a woman whose cultural horizons were as extensive as the political world that she very much helped to govern. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions if there are any, or comments, or yeah.
Thank you, Lucia. Thank you. Feel free to ask questions.
Certainly.
Please, go ahead.
I think that was a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much for making so clear the nature of her library. I value that. I wonder if you have had a look at the physical library, the built library, in which she kept the books.
So very interestingly, it's still in Mechelen, of course. It's right now they have a museum, the Museum of Van Busleyden. But the library, the room is closed. However, I'm aware that they are planning, because of the anniversary, a reopening of the space. So actually, I mean, I'm not really related to what is going on right now, but they are looking to do something with the space because right now you can visit the museum and you can walk through several rooms, but not the library. The library is closed. As far as I know, there was a big symposium in the beginning of the 2000s regarding this Margaret and the one before her that I mentioned. So maybe in 2002, I think it was, they made something with the space, but not that I'm aware of. So I haven't been able to be because it's not open.
I call your attention to it then because there's a description of her library in John Willis Clark's book on the care of books, in which he describes the physical library. And it is laid out, he says, on the lectern system instead of the shelf system, so that many of the books are set in reading position at a long desk or a series of long desks. And I think that may be useful in your consideration of the use to which she put the library, because it sounds like that's a convenient system for if you're going to have other people using your library as well. And
Yeah.
that would go to her agency in the or her cultural agency with others at this time. And I think that would be fascinating to look at.
Well, thank you so much. I'm writing that down for these last weeks that I have to finish my thesis. I'm definitely going to use this. But yeah, of course, it's very important how she engaged with the books, and because it's so difficult to actually find marks of ownership in the volumes, because it's something that she, as I said, did not tend to do for one reason or another. This disposition of the books in lecterns may be conceived as some kind of ownership, no? Or so. Thank you.
Yes. And best of luck with the
Thank you. Hey,
Hi, Lucia. I'm
hey.
wondering about the book in Hebrew. I'm not assuming that Margaret knew Hebrew, so it was more like a book for show. But what book is it? What is it about?
I will let you know in a second. It's 400 volumes, so it's a very big Excel. Uh, well, it's just because it's lost. Maybe that is why I didn't remember the answer. It was lost in the fire of El Escorial in the 17th century, and in the inventory is described as libro, book of Hebrew, literally. That is all it says. And as far as I know, and I've been working with the book of Margaret of Austria that I mentioned. She, like, when she doesn't know any trace, it's just like the book, and that's all. So of course we can assume it was in Hebrew. It would be very weird if it wasn't because of that description, but nothing else. So it's not included, for example, in the literary analysis because it's too vague. So that is one of the examples.
Yeah, so the
And
person who made up the inventory also didn't read Hebrew, and he just said this is a book in Hebrew.
exactly, yes.
One question perhaps about the Vives suggestions. So Vives apparently allowed books from Erasmus and Thomas More to be read, but both authors are sometimes or can be viewed as not only very good Christians, but also, condemning, the centralization of power and, this doesn't fit to me like, how Vives wanted her to read the books.
I must say that sometimes with these humanists, especially in this century, I feel like it's a little bit more like, okay, we share correspondence, we get along. I know you're political like a little bit. So yeah, you can read him if you feel like it. But it wasn't like comparing that curriculum for Mary I to other educational curriculums he did for male members of dynasties, like mainly is read devotional and sacred literature and yeah, set yourself in Christian quietness and cultivate your virtues. Uh, so
But did she have, did the library contain books by Erasmus or
no,
it
the
not at all?
library of the Mary I, I don't know
Yes.
because it's a collection I didn't explore. Uh, but Margaret didn't own any copy of Erasmus or Thomas More. But Erasmus worked in the court in Mechelen. He visited it, and he was part of the educational program of Charles V. So, I mean, Margaret, of course, knew him. Um, and Margaret, she didn't have either any copy of Vives' work. So this is more like well, what I'm trying to argue and I'm trying to explore if it makes sense, no, is that of course they didn't own these books, but they work as a yeah, as a key example to reconstruct an index, no, of what they were expecting to be reading. That doesn't mean they literally read this book and followed the rules one by one. More than this was like the social speech around them. And yeah, did they follow that or didn't they? And Margaret, even though like other women like Margaret of York, which is more 15th century, only own like devotional and sacred literature only like in 20 years, you find a library that is 400 volumes and it contains so many literary genres, like what happened, why the change out of the sudden, um why this different way of engaging with books from women that are only like 20 years apart.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, but Erasmus was only put later on the index, so he wasn't forbidden in the time of Margaret of Austria. But I
Yeah.
wonder about the small percentage of what you call printed books.
Mm-hmm.
Don't take incunables as completely printed books. But isn't it possible that she owned and that there were a lot more of those printed books in the library as actual contemporary literature? But these are all cheap books, of course. The books of Erasmus were not expensive books. Can it not be that there were a lot of these books that were not put in the inventory of the library because they were too cheap and that only the more expensive books, of course, the manuscripts, the incunables that were decorated, and I don't know whether the books you call print are those mostly in folio volumes, or are there also smaller books? Because there are books of Erasmus, more Vives, and so are often in octavo formats, or smaller, or quarto. But of course, compared with the books described in the catalogue, they are very cheap, and maybe they weren't
Yeah, but
the man or the woman who made the inventory considered them as not worthy of being included in the index. Isn't that possible?
yeah, it's possible. I mean, I wonder why, though, some of the volumes, because the printed volumes are all lost. We know that they are printed because it appears as printed book in the inventory. So it may be, but it would be, I don't know, like I guess then I should research why wouldn't they be included. And also, I don't know very well how I would make that assumption of ownership because I'm more interested in, yeah, in the ownership of the books, you know, and if there is not any trace about that. I can speculate, but there is nothing I can base
No,
on.
but one often sees in inventories of libraries, also later on, that folio and quarto books are inventorized in detail, and then the rest of the books is taken as one package also. Now, wouldn't it be strange that she had more incunables than contemporary printed books? That would mean that a library didn't acquire any contemporary books, in fact, only books that were older. Because the
Well,
manuscripts can be made after 1500 too, because noble people and the nobility they had even printed books
yeah.
written in manuscript because they were more beautiful. That's true.
Yeah, well, that is the thing, no? Like all the music volumes, for example, that she commissioned are manuscripts. So um, that is like contemporary to herself, and they are still in manuscript format, but precisely because of that, no? Because manuscript um, kept existing and kept being produced throughout the 16th century. It didn't stop because it was a sign of prestige and also of authority for them to keep able to keep literacy and knowledge under control. And yeah, but I don't know, I think the printed books that are especially mentioned in the inventories also show this kind of interest, no, by herself from this new materiality, as well as I mentioned the incunabula, particularly because I didn't work with all the incunabulas that she worked on. The only one that I actually worked with is the Melusina one, but I find very I don't know, striking that she chose to buy an incunabula in Castilian in Spain. Like it's very much, I don't know, a statement of personal taste, no? But yeah, anyway, I think that many of the manuscripts um, in the library are not only like old ones or inherited ones. She also commissioned a few of them. But yeah,
Okay, thank you.
I wonder I could actually know what she actually read. Like I want to know.
Yeah, that's very difficult to find out.
Yeah.
It's not because someone has a book in his library or her library that
Mm-hmm.
she has read it.
Mm-hmm.
I have many books I've never read.
Me too, and I don't have that many.
I have a personal question for you. So I understand, first of all, compliments for this very thorough analysis. I was very surprised by many of your findings. And it also gives a lot of context to the books, and that's particularly interesting. So my understanding is that you're going to finish your master's thesis in the coming weeks, months. Any plans beyond that? Are you going to elaborate this research further into a PhD research, or any plans in that?
Yeah, I'm right now. Yeah, I would love to keep researching this, and especially um that trying to research female women's engagement with books through, I don't know, I mentioned, for example, the dowry that was given by the Catholic kings to Margaret. I believe that very much the one that was behind that dowry was Isabel of Castile because of the types of books that are being recommended. I don't imagine Fernando actually organizing that. As well as, for example, the books that Margaret received by Margaret of York through inheritance. So how kind of women through gift giving and dowries created this kind of female network through books, precisely because they weren't only conceived as intellectual objects, no, they were conceived as prestige and very valuable objects next to jewels or tapestries. So like that, maybe that is the way they made travel, knowledge travel around, or a message being sparse around them, even if not intentionally. But yeah, that is my plan. I would love to keep researching